Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you, and welcome back to Now TV and Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I want to thank you for joining me here on Now TV as we continue to examine very closely the challenge of Christ. The challenge of Christ is found in John chapter 10, verse 37, where Jesus said, "Do not believe me for my words' sake, believe me for my works." What Jesus is saying here is, hey, look, if I don't do what I say I'm going to do, then don't believe me. I've said this before, let me reiterate it. Christianity is the singular religion. The only one that comes even remotely close is Judaism. But Christianity is the only, really, honestly, the only religion that issues that kind of challenge. You know, the Hindus, the Buddhists are so ethereal in their, quote, dogma. There is no evidentiary basis for those religions. The Islamic religion does not challenge people to test its claims. In fact, the radical elements of Islamism would try to hurt you for challenging their claims. So when we really genuinely look at the claims of Christ, at the words of Christ, we're forced to realize this is distinctive. And of course, we live in a very skeptical world. And on October the 12th, 2024, for instance, I'm going to be debating Dr. Richard Carrier. He is a very, very prominent, very famous doctor of history, PhD. And he says Jesus lied. If he didn't lie, he just overtly failed. Because after all, he said he was going to come in the first century, put an end to human history, etc. And of course, he didn't do it. Well, what I've been sharing with you here on Now TV for a good long while is how that literalistic, physical, materialistic concept of the day of the Lord, of the Parousia, the coming of Christ, is completely misplaced. It is not what the Bible predicted. And let me urge you, listen, go back into our earlier studies, in which I go back into the Old Testament. I began actually with Matthew 16, 27 and 28, in which Jesus said he was going to come in the glory of the Father. And what that means is, and this is confirmed by any number of scholars, all right? I didn't make this up, but it's parallel with John chapter 5, 21 and following, in which Jesus said, "From henceforth the Father judges no one, but has committed all judgment to the Son, that all men might honor the Son as they honor the Father." I can do nothing of myself, Jesus said, but what I see the Father do. In other words, Jesus was saying, I've been given the prerogative of judgment, and I am going to judge in the same way that I've seen the Father judge. How had Jesus seen the Father judge? How had he seen the Father come? Well, he had never seen Yahweh come out of heaven on a literal cloud. He had never seen Yahweh coming and destroying literal physical heaven and earth. He had never seen Yahweh coming, destroying the constellations of heaven, even though Isaiah 34 described the day of wrath, the day of Yahweh's wrath, as a time when the constellations of heaven would be melted and fall from the sky, etc., etc. Folks, this is Hebraic, poetic, metaphoric, or to use a fancy term, apocalyptic. Now, in scholarly circles, the term apocalyptic normally means end of the world, or eschatological prophecies generally are referred to as end of the world, end of time, etc., etc. Well, again, that's not what the Bible predicts. Okay, so we have a skeptical world out there that just insists, and unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, the Christian church has, for centuries, confirmed, listen to me carefully and catch the power of this. The Christian church has confirmed the skepticism of the atheist. What, Preston? What are you saying? What I mean by that is, the Christian church has taught, well, yes, the atheist, agnostics, unbelievers, they're right in saying that Jesus predicted he was going to come back at the end of time. Yeah, that's what Jesus predicted. And so the atheist goes, well, hallelujah. We agree. Now you've got a problem, Christian, because Jesus said, and his apostles said, they wrote that coming was very near 2,000 years ago. And all of a sudden, the modern church and even the ancient church goes into apoplectic fits and says, well, Jesus didn't really mean his generation. He meant this kind of people will not pass until all of these things are fulfilled, which is nonsensical. I'm sorry. I don't mean to be unkind, but it's simply nonsensical. That's not the meaning of this generation. Genia, the Greek word translated as generation, and when you have a demonstrative before it, it refers to a given period of time, a given people at a given period of time. And so they tell us, this generation refers to the generation that would see the signs. Well, that much is true, but the generation that would see the signs of the parousia was the first century generation. Or we are told, well, what it refers to is this generation refers to the Jewish race. No, that's wrong. Had Jesus wanted to say the Jewish race, he could have said that. He could have used a different word, genos, and not genia. He didn't use a different word. So on and on and on it goes, of the desperate attempts, argumentum ad desperatum, that non-Latin Latin term that I invented some years ago, to explain or to define and to describe literally the desperation of believers when they're confronted with the challenge of Christ. Okay, so I've been sharing with you over the last few weeks the fact that Jesus Christ and no biblical text literally predicted or ever predicted the literal, visible, bodily coming of Jesus at the end of time, at the end of the Christian age, etc., etc. That is a fatal and a gross misconstrual of what Jesus and the apostles predicted. Now, let's talk for a moment here about the Jewish expectation and the atheist expectation and the majority of Christian expectation. Because, as I said a moment ago, there's no question. The atheist says, Dr. Richard Carrier is going to argue, he already does argue, yes, Jesus predicted he was going to come back literally, visibly, bodily at the end of the Christian age or the end of time, the end of human history, whatever terms you would like to use, all right? That's the atheist position. And as I've just explained, the tragedy is the majority of Christians believe that's exactly what Jesus predicted. Well, guess what? In the ancient world, the Jews joined with, I should say, what they expected is what the Jews claim Jesus predicted, and what the majority of Christians today believe Jesus predicted. In the Jewish expectation, in the Jewish narrative, and in the Jewish timeline of eschatology, this is especially true, and I don't know if it's proper to say especially true or not, all right? But it is certainly true that in the Essene community, what we call, what we call the Dead Sea community, there was the expectation, they called him the teacher of righteousness. There was this expectation that the teacher of righteousness would come in the last days. They believed they were living in the last days. Well, they were right on that account too, only tragically so. Because you see, the Dead Sea community, the Qumran community as it's called, because that's where they lived, there was this expectation, there was this belief that not only were they in the last days, but this teacher of righteousness would come, and guess what? He would lead them as the army of God. Now look, this is amazing. It is generally believed that the Qumran community was a pretty small community. They didn't even consist of 5,000 followers, so far as we know. I've never read any historical source that would suggest that the Qumran community, and the archaeological evidence supports this, it was a pretty small community. You know, it didn't just stretch from here to there. Yet they believed that this teacher of righteousness was going to come and lead them as God's holy army, and they, this little bitty small group of people, were going to whip the Romans, devastate them. And not only that, when that happened, they were going to march triumphantly into Jerusalem, and they were going to purge the priesthood of all uncleanliness. They were going to purify the temple once again, and there was going to be a full, total, massive restoration of the Davidic kingdom. The Davidic kingdom from which Messiah would then rule the world. The Pharisees believed in that. They were not Essenes, but the Pharisees had that identical concept of the coming of Messiah. They believed it was a literalistic, militaristic, nationalistic restoration of the kingdom of David, in which all of the physical enemies would be physically destroyed. They believed that physical circumcision would once again be imposed in its purity, that the priesthood would be purged of all of its defilement. The temple would be clean and cleansed of all of the money changers, although they kind of like the money from there themselves, don't you know? But nonetheless, the Sadducees by and large controlled that aspect of it, but you get the point. So here we have, ladies and gentlemen, we have the Sadducees who didn't believe in that kind of restoration. Okay, set them aside. But we have the Pharisees who believed in the reestablishment of an earthly, Davidic, national, quasi-military theocracy on earth that would be brought in by the coming of the Messiah, the judgment, and the resurrection. That's what the Essenes believed, by and large, and that's what the Pharisees believed. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what modern-day Christianity, or let me restate, modern-day dispensationalism says was the biblical expectation. And once again, the atheists are sitting on the sideline going, you got it, you got it. That is precisely what they were expecting, and it failed. This proves Jesus is a failed prophet. The Bible is totally untrustworthy. Once again, Richard Carrier, that I'll be debating in October the 12th, 2024. I just watched a video by him in which he says, the Gospels of Jesus, they're myths, they're fables, they're fakes, they're frauds. Not anything in them is true. Nothing there. Totally unreliable. Listen to me carefully and please catch the power of this. When modern-day Christians concede and teach that, yes, Jesus predicted his coming at the end of time, at the end of the current age. When modern-day Christianity teaches that, they are falling into the trap of the atheist and the agnostic, of the Jew and of the Muslims, who, of course, the Muslims have their own concept of an earthly kingdom, and the Jews always had their concept of an earthly kingdom in which Messiah would rule the world. But you see, the Jews know, atheists know, Muslims know that Jesus predicted his coming, and thus the coming of the kingdom, for the first century. That's their argument. There used to be a website on the internet called Jews for Judaism. And it was an evangelistic and apologetic website dedicated to proving that Christianity is false. Do you know what one of their top reasons was? Well, more than obvious that Jesus predicted his coming at the end of human history, at the end of time, in the first century. Everyone knows he failed. Therefore, Christianity is false. Folks, do you see how important this is? Do you see how important it is to be able to answer the challenge of Christ and not just wave the hand at it and say, oh, well, as one man said in a formal debate that I had with him in 1983, and I kept emphasizing the importance of proper exegesis. And that's what this program is all about. It's about proper hermeneutic. It is about proper exegesis. And as I kept impressing on that audience there that day of the importance of proper hermeneutic and proper exegesis, he got frustrated and finally gets up in one of his speeches and says, well, you know, Don just simply talks about all this, the importance of exegesis. He said, I want to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I don't need no exegesis. All I need is Jesus. Do you think that argument's going to work against the atheist, the agnostic, the Jew, the Muslim? No, it is not. We have to equip ourselves. Just like Peter said, sanctify Christ in your heart and be ready always to give an apology, apologia, an orderly defense of the hope that lies within you. That's what you and I are supposed to do. Now, Okay, so what I'm doing here, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm demonstrating what the accepted consensus view of the kingdom, the coming of the Lord, the judgment, and the resurrection was in the first century. It is so incredibly important that we realize Jesus, rejected the consensus Jewish belief concerning the nature of the kingdom. Did you catch the power of what I just said? Jesus rejected the very kind of kingdom that the Jews, including the Essenes, including the Pharisees, Jesus rejected the very kind of kingdom that the atheists claim that he said he'll come back to establish. Jesus rejected the very kind of kingdom that dispensationalism says he will come back to establish. Jesus categorically, repeatedly rejected the very kind of kingdom that serves as the ground and the basis for the skeptical challenge against Jesus Christ. Now, I know this may be challenging to you, and I'm only going to begin to investigate that in the time that I have left. Consider the following. In Matthew chapter 4, Jesus has gone into the wilderness. He is fasting for 40 days. Satan appears to him, his adversary, and among other, among other challenges and among other temptations that Satan confronted Jesus with. If you're truly the Son of God, turn these stones into bread. You've been out here a long time. Aren't you hungry? But one of those challenges was he showed Jesus all the kingdoms of the world, the cosmos. Or is that oikumene? I have to go back and double check that. I've forgotten. Okay. Point of it is, he showed him all the kingdoms of the world. Now, why did Jesus come? When Pilate asked him much later, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "For this reason I was born." Yep. I came to be king. So here is Satan, who said, "If you will but bow down before me, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world." Okay, here are the kingdoms of the world. Here is Satan, who is the ruler of the world, ostensibly. And he says, all you got to do is just bow down and worship me. And they're yours. Isn't that what Jesus wanted? To rule his kingdom over the world? Jesus categorically rejected that offer. And some may try to justify that and just simply say, well, point of fact is, he wanted to establish that kingdom himself. He certainly did not want Satan to give it to him and thus being in submission to Satan. Well, that's true, but guess what? Had Jesus wanted that kind of kingdom, he could have had it later on. And not only that, when he was in the garden, and here come the soldiers, and Peter cuts off the ear of one of the men coming to take Jesus to crucify him. And Jesus said, we'll talk more about this later, "Put up your sword. Those who live by the sword shall die by the sword." Okay, but that's the kind of kingdom the Jews wanted. Militaristic, everybody grab a sword, let's go. Let's go fight the Romans. And Jesus rejected it. But Jesus said to his apostles, do you not know? I mean, this is in the hour of his trial, of his passion. Do you not know that I could pray to the Father and he would give me legions of angels to come to my assistance? In other words, look, guys, I've got it. I've got the authority in my hand to destroy the Romans. I've got the authority to prevent my death. I've got the authority to establish through military might, through miraculous power, to establish an earthly kingdom. I've got that authority. Not why I came. Listen, folks, this is so challenging to the traditional views of eschatology. You see, if you cannot prove that Jesus had in mind his coming, literally, visibly, and bodily, to put his enemies down physically through military conflict, 200 million soldier army of Revelation chapter 9. If you can't prove that's what Jesus had in mind, then perhaps it's time to take a fresh look about or at the nature of the kingdom that Jesus said he came and wanted to establish and would establish at his parousia. What kind of king did he want to be? What kind of kingdom did he say he came to establish? When we examine those questions, then it becomes more than obvious that Jesus was predicting an invisible parousia, an invisible but real kingdom, but not at the end of time. Speaking of the end of time, my time today has come. Thanks for joining me.